On the end here, we thank Anne Moroney for joining us. Anne is the Chief Executive Officer of the RDA in the Barossa. And Anne's job lies in all the things we've been discussing here today: regional growth strategies, building partnerships and harnessing opportunities for the region. Anne, thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
On the far end, Alan Gamlin, whose research of interest, as you would have heard, includes human migration and ethnicity, with a special focus on the governance of international migration and transnationalism. Andrew Beer, whose research includes the operation and functioning of Australia's housing markets, the drivers of regional growth, economic change in major cities, and the impacts of an ageing population. And I accidentally referred to him as Professor before, and his mates have been congratulating him for the last 2 hours. The Chair of the Training and Skills Commission, Michael Boyce. What are the sectors that we can expect the strongest employment growth in over the next few years, in your opinion?
I think there's been a lot written, certainly by people with who've taken a deeper look at it more broadly, but it seems that certainly education is one of the big sectors, the services, and that includes professional services and services, engineering type services to defence, continuing to be to mining, and certainly engineering services in the robotics field, which we all know is just a growing and growing one. There's certainly for South Australia, food and tourism are some of the big sectors, and particularly in the region I work in, all these sectors have relevance and they're a big opportunity for South Australia, and particularly the Barossa, Gawler, Adelaide Plains and Light regions.
And can you see those areas of growth being popular and accessible across all age groups of workers?
Yes. One of the discussions I came across at the tables was around barriers, and there are a number of young people at the table. So I said to them, so what do you see as the workforce issues in the region? And they said, when we leave school, we don't have the skills and experience, and every job advertised wants skills and experience. Mostly people want a manager of something. So I asked employers as I went around the tables, what are your biggest issues? And they said, finding qualified staff. But when you dug deeper, they said, well, actually it was attitude and aptitude, which was most important to them, not the experience they had. So there's a clear disconnect in what's being advertised for and what people are able to offer. And I think maybe it's a 360-degree view on helping employers understand best what they really need. You know, they're pretty busy. They're trying to run a business, keep their head above water and work out what's next on the horizon. If they can be supported to think through more clearly as to what they want, find access to those HR-specific skills that was also raised as missing, particularly in agricultural enterprises, to help them understand where they will get that employee of the future, the one who's going to make a real difference to their business, and help young people understand too how they need to add value and can add value in a partnership with the employer, not in a we and they relationship.
Michael Boyce, there'd be a question in there for you somewhere. When you're considering the age groups of those who are looking for work in South Australia, what do you then tell your training providers?
That's a good question. I just want to pick up on something that Anne just said, and I concur 100% with what Anne was just saying, and our recent experiences in the Commission are certainly supporting that. One of the things that's evolving in my mind, and I'm not sure this is actually translated into any form of real model just yet, is the concept around, and I talked about this at our table discussion before, around cadetships, and that is that I think employers have got to do that 180-degree turnaround and start thinking about, we'll employ for attitude and aptitude, and we'll train the skills that they need. And so many times we go out looking for qualified people, but I think we've got to start thinking beyond that and start looking at people with the right attitudes, with the right mindsets, looking at the potential in that person and then training them accordingly. Having said that, based on your question, we've also got an ageing workforce. We know that We've got the baby boomer generation, my generation, that wants to stay in the workforce and perhaps is being forced to in some cases longer than they want to. So our training system has to be able to accommodate from school-based apprentices and trainees right through to people in their 60s, I suspect, who want to be retrained. So it's a very complex model, but that's why there's growth in the training industry, which Anne referred to. There's clearly an opportunity for career path development in the training sector. But we just have to get the model right around what does that look like and what do training providers need. And that's the advice that the Commission will provide to the Minister and the Government around what does that model look like, what are the needs of it, how do we get skill sets. Industries want some skill sets, some sort of building blocks training, not just qualifications, but to be able to build on that as well. So I hope I've answered your question, but it's a bit of a complex model.
Aside from the issue of age, what are some of the key issues and trends that you see emerging from the training and skills sector?
Some of the things that have been spoken about by some of the speakers today, and I also touched on them a little bit earlier, around that ability to have an adaptive workforce and have adaptable training systems to be able to cope with that, because we know that the jobs of yesterday and the jobs of today are not necessarily the jobs of tomorrow. Clearly, there's some evidence around the younger generation not just changing jobs but changing careers. So we need systems that will facilitate that changing of careers. People can transport their qualifications from one sector to another, or at least get some recognition for some of their training to carry through into other sectors. Those are the sorts of challenges that we're particularly hearing about. We're certainly hearing from employers that saying that they want the youth of today to be more job ready than they are, and I say to those employers that you've got to invest in those people. Hire for the right attitude, hire for the potential, but you've got to invest in that training. So they're the sorts of things we're hearing. I talked a little bit about in my presentation around reviewing apprenticeships and traineeships, the adult community education sector particularly, and I touched on NDIS of course, and the emerging industries. We know that we've got people have talked about manufacturing is clearly shrinking. What can we evolve into? What other skills do we need to be able to evolve into that? And so they're just some of the challenges anyway, but there's plenty of them. Hopefully.
Well, let's take a look at business. Andrew Beer, my question for you, what do you believe are the biggest barriers for regional business?
Look, given the discussions I just attended prior to the coffee break, clearly skill shortages are currently an enormous barrier for many regions across South Australia. I had someone at one of the tables talking about if you had 50 diesel mechanics, we could fill those jobs next week. And that's only indicative of just a small number of these sorts of skill areas where there are shortages. So clearly that's going to be a major barrier. I think access to information, in the long term, that's going to be a critical issue. Now that's going to get better with the complete rollout of NBN and whatever form that takes over time. But it's also going to create other challenges in the sense that not every part of Australia, every part of South Australia is going to be on the NBN. And then you need to know how to use it to the best advantage. Sure, your website's going to download faster, but so is everyone else's website. And so the pressure's going to be on to be more and more competitive in a globalised world. And I think that's a challenge in terms of how businesses restructure, and I think it's a challenge in terms of how the skill sets of the workforce change over time. And I was really struck by the presentation we saw this morning from the Harndorf Inn, Old Mill Harndorf. When you think a relatively simple innovation involving the hiring of one graduate who's a native Chinese speaker adds 40 jobs to the local economy. But not every business has that potential for growth. So how do they keep up? So I think there's a real gap there in terms of how we improve our business processes so that regional businesses can keep pace with those in other parts of the globe.
Can I just add, I think it's pretty much the conclusion of what you're saying, though, it's relevance. And having businesses stay relevant, I think, is the biggest challenge for especially country business. We've got to stay connected with the consumer, stay ahead, and that's what the Harndorf Inn example was, understanding the new and emerging market and becoming relevant to them. And it has the chance for exponential growth if we stay relevant.
We're talking very broadly about this, about business, about the skills that we'll need in the future. What are some of the actions that you think the business owner, be they a sole business owner, a family business owner, somebody who thinks, can I send somebody off for training for a day and then how am I going to backfill that person? Are there, I guess, a list of pointers that you're able to give a business owner to help this?
I think that one thing I always think business owners should do is ask themselves the question each day, am I working in the business or am I working on the business? And I think that's been a challenge in many parts of regional South Australia for a very long time now. And I think the idea of just scraping by and just finding a solution to the daily challenges is no longer going to cut it in the economy we're moving towards. One of the discussions I participated in before the coffee break, people were saying, you're emphasising engagement between industry and universities, but we're an RDA or we're a local government, and we can't engage with industry. We call meetings and they won't come. And that tells me that... And that tells me that those businesses are too busy to look out for their own future. And so if they're down there fighting in the trenches, getting every customer, getting every dollar, getting every 5-cent coin they can find, they're not looking to the future of their business and they're trapped and they need to find a way out. So I think that's the one key thing they have to do. And I guess the people in this room, if they're not business people themselves, have to find ways to help them do that.
Let's take a question now for Alan Gamlin. As you might remember, his research of interest includes human migration and ethnicity. Alan, what are some of the key points that affect regional business that you feel are due to population change?
Well, obviously there's a saying, demography is destiny. So, I think all population changes have a real impact on industry. But I think, one of the things that I'm learning about being in South Australia is that the process of ageing is particularly profound, has a particularly profound effect on regional industry here. So, I don't think it can be seen as a wholesale negative. Certainly, older people have the skills, the resources, the mindsets that can make a huge contribution to economies of regions. So it's not the case that they're a drain. They also often create demand for services which can be a spur to industry. But I think, so it's not a wholesale negative of that sort of population megatrend. But I think we need to just be very mindful of the fact that in the long term, a worsening dependency ratio, a ratio of a dependent elderly population and dependent youth population to a relatively small size working age population has really profound economic impacts that will transform regions. And so for me, one of the things that really came through in all the conversations I had today was just how do local industries and regional industries prepare for this coming digital disruption, the digital disruption that we're already seeing, given that population megatrend of ageing. And that's a question I don't have an answer to, but I think that's where the challenge lies.
I was going to say, at what stage is that disruption concerning people? Was it in the discussions for those who were looking at the getting careers started?
Well, yes, yeah. One example that stuck out for me, I hope my colleague down on the table doesn't mind me mentioning this, but was the example of the banking industry. Now, I've got a friend over in the US who is an academic who works on the governance of pension funds and sovereign wealth funds. And he wrote an article recently talking about the financial industry. He said the title of the article was 1998 called It Wants Its Technology Back. And the idea is that unlike many other industries, the finance industry is reliant on all these sort of Microsoft Office tools that came out in the late 1990s, and actually it's relatively undisrupted by technological change. Now, in the conversation that we're having around the table, even an industry like that, which is using 1998 technology, has fundamentally been transformed from an industry where you started a job as a sort of a teenager or a young adult and have a job for life, to one where there's an incredibly mobile workforce doing a very different range of jobs than they did previously, very tech heavy, and where there's an extremely high turnover in the workforce. So I think, that's one example of how this is already biting, even in an industry that isn't particularly affected by technological disruption. And that to me is kind of I don't want to say canary in the coal mine, but it's a harbinger.
But surely people need not to be afraid of it, but to open their eyes to it a bit. And sometimes it's thinking laterally and understanding where the opportunities come from. One of my favourite disruption examples or anecdotes, and it's a little tiny one, I know it doesn't really apply generally, but you know how local clothes manufacturing was disrupted by a lot of cheap imports, and then cheap imports in a retail shop were disrupted by online shopping. And so now all the tailors and seamstresses are back in business because people are buying stuff online that doesn't fit. And so they're just going gangbusters. But sometimes and with new machines often, that help them be more efficient. We've got a uniform manufacturer in the Barossa. They make all the not all, but many of the uniforms, the school uniforms, work uniforms, walkout clothes for sporting teams in downtown Tanunda. They've got pretty high-tech machinery and a workforce of 6 or 8, and they need skilled workers. I'm sure there must be a few left over from the Levi's factory somewhere. But there are some traditional elements in the disruption coming back. And I think one of the things for business, just keep thinking laterally and look where the opportunities are, not freeze up because it is change.
And let's continue on that train of thought. Now, Mayor Alan Orgy this morning mentioned it, Minister Jeff Brock mentioned it. We want to make products in South Australia that are unique. We've got skilled craftspeople. We want, to be proud of the things that we put out. Where then, and I think Andrew Holmes brought this into discussion too, where then do we get that balance between making a local product and joining the global supply chain? I've got Anne, sorry.
Looking at me. Well, again, it's about fear. It's so easy to connect with markets, especially with a few support mechanisms. I know we've taken a big focus on that in our RDA in terms of understanding relevant export markets, finding how we connect with them, engaging the resources that we can. So we have a Trade Start officer based out of our office and just using as much as we can to connect with business, identified the markets for different products. For food, it's probably the Middle East. For other products, especially wine, it's China and North Asia. And just finding the pathways for business to get through and helping them understand what they need to. Some people have products that aren't suited to those markets. So you look to see what the opportunities domestically are, or even better still, work out where the markets are and then what they're going to do for their products. I think it's different, it's changing, but it's not really rocket science. It's just a bigger world than it can be because we're connected with it now. It's, I don't think it's scary, it's just helping businesses find the way.
If I can just add to that, we know that this state is built on small to medium enterprise, and that's going to be the way forward, I think, for South Australia in so many different ways. And if I could give any word to business, is to use the organisations like the RDAs and the industry leaders groups and the local councils or whatever it might be, is to seek that advice and support because it's out there. But when people are scratching around trying to find the next dollar in their businesses, sometimes they do, I think as Andrew said it before, they forget about those things. But it is there, the support mechanisms are there, they've just got to connect. And that is just, I think it's a state of innovation. I think we've got a long, proud history of doing that, and we just need to make sure we're, like I said before, adaptive about doing that.
Maybe if we invest in the creative industries more, it'll help people open up those lateral pathways. Is that right, Steve Saffel?
We'll come to a bit of a wrap-up of what you all learned from sitting at the tables in just a moment. But Alan, if I can return to you, what are some of the positive and negative migration trends that you see happening in the regions?
Well, I mean, I think I talked about them a little bit in my talk earlier on today, and I should again, add a health warning that as a relatively recent migrant myself to South Australia, I'm still coming to grips with the local trends and dynamics. But I would say, as a general point for migration trends between metropolitan and non-metropolitan areas, not only in South Australia but more generally in Australia and globally, there are probably three important things going on. One of the important ones, as we all know in the room here, is the loss of young people who are entering their early career stages, and this is, obviously a threat in terms of the potential brain drain. If you lose the best and the brightest, and the brawn drains, if you're getting an overall loss of labour power. But then you've got these compensatory trends that result from both international replacement migration, which I think is a positive trend. There needs to be obviously support, a supportive environment for the integration of new migrants. There needs to be counteracting of untrue negative stereotypes about migration in order to prevent some of the community tensions that arise from migration sometimes. But on the whole, that I would say that's a positive trend, seeing more international migration into the regions rather than just going into the cities. And then another one, as I mentioned, which isn't a migratory trend so much as the impact of migration on international connections. And now, it's the migrants who become the connectors. And I think, this big shift from an economy that's based around sort of shifting large, heavy things to distant markets to an economy where you're dealing in innovation and your competitive advantage is connectedness. It's those international migrants who can actually act as beachheads and bridges between cultures, and they can help local firms to internationalise or to get into new markets by providing an understanding of the operating environment in those new places. And so I think while that's not, those international connections aren't migration themselves, they're a direct impact of migration. And I think we should see that as a positive development in terms of trying to transform the economy towards a more knowledge-led economy.
Aside from the stereotypes that you mentioned, are there any negatives that you think it's well worth us being aware of?
Of migration?
Of migration.
Well, I mean, a lot of the negatives are largely overblown. So, for example, there's a great internet meme that circulated during the election during the sort of Brexit and Donald Trump campaign, and it was called the title was Schrodinger's Immigrant. This is the immigrant who lazes around on benefits at the same time as stealing your job. And the point is, it's like the Schrodinger's cat in the famous physics experiment, which, because of quantum physics, is both dead and alive at the same time. The point is, migrants can't do this. You can't be both stealing someone's job and lying around on benefits. And I think that points to just the fallacy of many of the stereotypes around migration that circulate. It is true that sometimes there is competition between migrants and native workers, but it's very focused in particular skill sectors, and it doesn't have an overall, many studies have shown that it doesn't have an overall impact on wages. So I think many of the kind of typical sort of stereotypes that we hear about the negative impacts of migration are overblown.
Alan, you sat in the discussions about getting careers started. What are some of the most important takeaway messages that you got from those discussions?
Well, again, I think it was about technological disruption, and just those discussions impressed upon me how providing the skills for today's industries is one challenge, but the real challenge in a way is providing the skills for tomorrow's industries. I went to a briefing at PricewaterhouseCoopers a couple of weeks ago on the federal budget, and I remember the former CEO of ANZ saying there, that what we really need for this new economy is IT engineers. And so, when I hear this sort of discussion around mismatch of skills and opportunities, it's not just about what I don't just think about, the current mismatches, I think about the mismatches with what the future economy is going to require.
Andrew Beer, what will you take back to your team at the University of South Australia when it comes to industry engagement?
One of the things we're very keen to show now is that we have impact. And that's an important issue for us. If we can show impact, if we can show that we're reshaping your community or reshaping your industry, that's worth a lot to us. And that's a point of engagement and departure for future discussions. Thank you.
He was doing such a good job without it, isn't he? The university lecturer in the room here. And finally, I'll throw this one to you, Michael. What do you believe is the most important takeaway of today in regards to workforce in the regions?
As I said earlier today, the regions have got common themes running through them, but unique characteristics built around certain industries or seasonal issues or workforce problematic, issues, so to speak. I'm a bit like Andrew that we want to continue to engage because there's no single one answer. It is very much around listening, engaging, and taking that feedback back to make sure that we've got adaptive systems or flexible systems that are fit for purpose. That we send a very strong message to small business and to youth in particular around the potential to provide careers, if you like, and training opportunities for them. It's very easy and I'm going to focus a bit on the youth of today, but it's very easy to be negative about the youth of today, and we get a bit hung up sometimes on their social media attributes and things that they do. But out there are people who want to be believed in, who want to have faith placed in them. They want to see career paths or opportunities or development. I think that's important for the regions. I was just thinking at our table before when we were sitting there with several of the young apprentices and trainees or ex-apprentices and trainees about leaving their regions and why they leave their regions. And if they don't see a job, if they don't see a potential for a job, they're not going to stay. They will go to the cities or they'll move interstate or overseas or whatever. So if they can see potential, if they see that someone will believe in them, if they see that there's someone who'll give them an opportunity. I know it's well documented, they all want to be the boss of tomorrow, but we know that mentoring will improve completion rates on apprenticeships and traineeships dramatically because it's somebody who's taking care of them, looking after them, keeping an oversight of them. Particularly, more importantly, in the regions, if you take the case of someone who moves from one region to another, they leave behind their family, their friends, and they've got to build a new life in that community. If there isn't somebody who believes in them, supports them, that could be destined to fail. So, like I said, it's very complex, but I'm a great believer that in that mentoring approach, making sure that we're not just teaching them the hand skills or the mindset skills or customer service skills, that we're actually looking after their holistic needs and making sure that they've got somewhere, a roof over their head, they've got 3 meals on the table or whatever it might be, and dealing with the girlfriend issues or financial problems they're facing or whatever. But we know that they will finish those apprenticeships or qualifications. And if we look after those people, even if they drift off and go to the cities, they'll come back. So it's got its own set of issues, but I think that's my view of the world anyway.
And the demography is destiny. And relevant to that point, that we can't overlook the ability to influence that demography. And that's through paying some attention to place development and place management, which is, of course, a product of all parties. Certainly local government has a strong interest, but so does community, to work to create the places and spaces and facilities and community infrastructure that the people we want to target to be part of our community will enjoy and live there. And in that vein, I'll be interested to see whether the measures in the federal government's budget on university hubs might actually be part of that change too, by creating places where students can have a more of a collegiate collaborative model for online learning at any university where they can still live at home might help that. But certainly developing the places and spaces where if people don't stay, they at least want to come back to because it's a great place to live and bring up a family is really important.
And not all of them like smashed avocado either, I don't think.
You can get smashed avocado in the country, there's no doubt about that.
One of the big challenges I find in our poorer communities, I live in Peterborough in the sort of far mid-north, quite a poor town. And one of the challenges of our young people that we're trying to move into training, especially apprenticeships, is them having the ability to access their training at places like Regency and other TAFE and training providers. There are some RTOs that will come out and do on-job training, but having said that, I really like to see our young people accessing our TAFE training providers wherever possible. And it's a bit of a catch-22. You put a young person into a traineeship or apprenticeship, and then suddenly they find themselves having to attend weeks of training many, many kilometres away. Are there any plans afoot to help young people in sort of catch-22 poverty traps to get beyond that?
I'll take that one if you like. Thank you. I just recently met with the CEO of TAFE SA, and some of you will already know this, but nevertheless, hopefully it'll be reassuring to hear it, that TAFE SA is certainly transforming itself. I don't think that's a secret that's in the paper, but it is moving towards a more flexible, adaptive kind of training model where it can. And Robin was saying to me the other day, I think they've got something like 38 campuses at the moment, which has been shrinking, you probably know that. But what they've now got is something like 250 training places. And that's because they're sending trainers out into the workforce. They're sending them out to the local mechanics workshop or the local sawmill or the local boilermaker or whatever it might be. So they're doing more and more, where possible, on-site skills assessments and training. So as we also know, you can go to certain elements of online training, and it's easier in some trades or vocations than others. It doesn't work for all of them, I accept that. But what industry needs, and more so in the regions, absolutely so, is where you've got very thin markets, you absolutely need the ability for trainers to be able to go out to those workplaces and do that sort of assessment. The good news is TAFE is taking that decision, and it's actively doing that. I'm sure the Minister's going to sit here and nod and agree with me because she knows all about it. But for you in the room, I can tell you firsthand that that is the model, that's what they're doing. There are private RTOs who do that now, but of course it's a bit tougher on the private RTOs to move into very thin markets. The public provider is probably able to do that either a little more nimbly or a little bit more because it's funded by the government. But I think the good news for you, Harry, is that it's coming. It may not be right there today, it might not be there tomorrow, but it's coming, and I think there is solutions at hand. Okay.
Very similar issues came up in regards to delivery of NDIS services in regional areas, that the thin customer base, the fact there doesn't seem, certainly to my knowledge, I could be wrong, to be travel supplements for those who have to travel to deliver the services. So it's a very similar sort of issue for NDIS services.
There are travel subsidies available to employers for the regions. So if a student, because under the modern awards, the employer is now responsible for those costs of training if they've got to go to another region or another location. But the employer can then actually apply and get some subsidies back from the state government.
Yeah, I was more referring to the professional services providers who go out for NDIS.
I suppose this one's for Professor Allen. You talk about 3 options for bringing people into the regions. You go option 1, international migration, option 2, return migration, and option 3 is connecting people that have left and is sort of alumni about the local opportunities that are available. Do you know of any regions or cities or states where they do this stuff particularly well that you can explain to people?
I think looking at the international examples is the way to go here. I mean, we've seen, for example, in places like Mexico that lose a large number of people to the US across the border. There's been a huge upsurge in the creation of hometown associations and the role of government engaging with those hometown associations across the border. So, for example, the government of Mexico, the Foreign Affairs Service of Mexico, maintains a network of more than 50 consulates in the USA, which the aim of which is really to engage with these migrants and, provide exactly those kinds of incentives to connect those people who are, doing well in business or in politics and so forth in the US and who can help their hometowns, or indeed to repatriate them where it's appropriate, where they're at the sort of time of life when they're considering a move back. There are examples all around the world of similar kinds of return migration / diaspora engagement efforts afoot. I think New Zealand is another example where there's been a great deal of efforts to do this, and there's international replacement migration has been occurring for a very long time. So New Zealand has one of the highest migration churns in the OECD. Sends a great deal of migrants proportional to its population, but it also brings in a number of, an even higher number of migrants. And the migrants that it brings in have, on average, a higher degree of qualifications than the people who leave. So I think there are examples of best practice around the world where countries are doing this. I couldn't give you an example. I'm sure there are examples in Australia of regions that are doing this pretty well. I don't know of them.
I was going to say there's a great example in the UK, a town called Hebden Bridge, where they developed their arts community strongly, and the growth in the town was exponential. Whether the arts is your thing or not, it tends to bring a whole lot of people, and a whole lot of people who want to set up and live in a town where there's a vibrant arts community. And I think that's just one that springs to mind, but I think there's a common theme. They say it's one of the attractors for Silicon Valley is that it's got a vibrant creative community. It does work to create that kind of atmosphere people want to hang out in.
We've heard a lot today, and look, we've answered this in many different ways, but let's say that I am a small business owner in a regional town. It's not really my responsibility to keep the town afloat or to get people to move there. I'm certainly not holding up the entire state's economy, but what would you say to me is the advantages of being a regional business? I'd love to hear from all of you.
Actually, a colleague of Andrew's, Terry from Texas, who is head of the School of Economic Development at North Texas University, said rather wisely that it's the wives and children who decide where businesses go and where people live. And so if you've got a regional business and it's a positive business in that you're connected with your customers and you're working innovatively on it, you offer a lifestyle for your family that, especially while they're young, that is hard to compete with. That should be connected with community. There's a sense of belonging. There's a sense of being connected with the people around you. And in the wider sense, that then translates into a better business environment because clusters happen where there's connectivity, or performing clusters happen where there's connectivity in the first place. So my answer, as someone who has a small business in a regional area, is that it's got all the advantages of good business and good lifestyle that you could possibly want. You just have to believe in it and do it.
I think the point that I'd add to that and is that when you're in the regions, one of the things that sometimes it's difficult when you're working in a silo looking at your own business is to forget, like I said earlier, about working a little bit more holistically. But I think is collaboration, is that regional communities have a great habit and a great way about going around things by supporting each other. And I think no more is that true of today and tomorrow in the future is about collaboration and making sure that they're supporting each other, working together to build on those opportunities, improve their skills or their business skills or whatever, and become a stronger part of the community. But collaboration, I think, is a lot of the key.
I think, the big advantage for a regional business being in South Australia or a business being in regional South Australia is that in a complex, fast-changing world, the location offers a degree of stability. So once a business gets its workforce, they're more likely to stay. You're more likely to have long-term relationships with your suppliers and your customers. And that then allows you to focus on those things that you want to change. You get the opportunity to develop your product, to carve out new opportunities and to explore new markets in a focused way rather than trying to be pushed hither and thither because 5 of your staff left that week. I think that's a huge advantage.
As somebody who's migrated here relatively recently with a young family, I think it's a way that engages with global markets. How do you move beyond just serving a local marketplace to tapping into global connections and upscaling your business?